The parable of the vineyard is a very interesting parable, and we're going to look at the world of viticulture because it had an indelible mark on the culture in the first century. So knowledge of cultivating and pruning and harvesting and treading the grapes becomes very important. Come join me for this session of the parable, Exile to Return. Shalom, I'm Dr. Dina Dye with Foundations in Torah. Welcome back to this series, Parables from Exile to Return. And last time we introduced the parable of the vineyard, which is actually one of my favorite parables. And I went through the whole story. I would just encourage you to go back and reread it yourself. You can go to Matthew 21:33, for example, and read the story in there. We talked about how the master of the household, which represented God, or possibly, if we were looking at it in temple terms, the high priest, planted the vineyard, put a hedge around it, dug a wine press, built a tower, and then leased it to some tenant farmers. And those tenant farmers were actually, in temple terms, speaking of the priests at the time. So that's the backdrop, kind of important if we're going to look at this parable in the way that it was intended. Of course, fruit season is coming, harvest is coming, and the master of the household has sent his servants, and the servants are going to go to the tenants and collect the fruit, what the harvest will bear. And the tenants proceed to beat them up. Finally, the master sends his son, his own son, assuming that the tenants will respect him. Interesting if you put this back in the perspective of, say, John chapter 2, for example, when Yeshua goes in and overturns the tables of money changer tables. You have to understand that Yeshua at that time, he was the priests who are running the show, the temple leadership, the leading elites of the day. Yeshua was stepping on their toes. This was their turf. This is where they made money. This is where they had power and control. And so along comes Yeshua, who folks recognized him as the king, not the ones that are running the temple. This is a power struggle here. And so when the son comes, this is how the language that we're seeing here, that the Pharisees and Sadducees of the time, actually more so the Sadducees, are not thrilled about Yeshua stepping on their toes and bringing attention to the corruption, etc. So that is one of the reasons that we see in this parable that the priests wanted to kill the son, that father sent his son to kill the son. So that's all kind of tucked away in this as well. And so they basically threw him out of the vineyard. They killed him, and the vineyard would be leased to other tenants, if you will. So the other tenants would be the ones to share the fruit. And tucked away in this, although it seems kind of random, Yeshua says that the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. But this all takes us back to the cosmic temple, the building of the cosmic temple in the creation week. That's the foundation of all of this. So again, in the parables, the language of kingship and the kingdom and the rulership takes us back to the cosmic rulership and not really the kingdom per se in that culture and time, because again, Rome's running the show, so are the Herodians, the line of the Herodians, and so are the temple elites. And there's also another quote from the Psalms in this particular parable is from Psalm 118, 22 through 33. It says, "This came from Adonai and is marvelous in our eyes," where this quote that we have. And it talks about that the kingdom will be taken away from you and given to people who are producing fruit. Again, the temple in this pattern is, the vineyard is a metaphor for the temple. And though in the natural, the kingdom belonging to the priests, the high priest, those who are ruling at that particular time, it will be removed from them and given to the folks, those who have who have made a covenant with God, who have been restored in their relationship to Him. That part of the people who by the shed blood, and obviously in time when Yeshua's blood is shed, the covenant will be restored. And so the kingdom will be taken away from the ones running the show and given to those who will become a kingdom of priests. Speaking of course, starting there in the first century with those folks, and eventually it will take its course around the world over millennia, if you will. So this was kind of a slap, if you will, to the ruling priests of the time, the Kohanim. Again, the Sadducees are really the ones that they have the control there. There's a power struggle, and Yeshua is really dealing with them, that whoever falls on the stone will be shattered, and the one on whom it falls will be crushed, because these tenant farmers are the temple priests of the day who have become quite corrupt and who are in league with Rome in many ways. And so they, of course, the ones that would throw out the heir, the son, Messiah, the true high priest, whose rightful place was the temple, but he was not going to rule and reign from that sphere because it had become corrupt and contaminated. A new house would have to be built. And so when the master comes, he will bring the current temple leadership to an end. How does he do that? Well, basically, he uses his instrument, Rome, and Rome ultimately destroys the temple, and the people are scattered. And so this is just, again, reminding us that this isn't about the nuts and bolts of the time. This is showing us something greater. This is showing us the cosmic kingdom. This is showing us the greater kingdom than what's in front of them. That's what they see, that's what they experience, but there is something much greater, and this is the message that Yeshua the Messiah brought at that time. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of our program that the viticulture of the time really made quite a mark on the culture. It was very, very important. It conveyed a meaning, a symbolic meaning about the community, about Israel, about God, about all kinds of things. So wine, of course, was one of the chief agricultural products of Israel. And so in order to cultivate, one had to have knowledge in that area. It took time to learn, and they passed this down to their sons, those who had vineyards, and they had to learn the art of pruning and harvesting and treading the grapes. That, of course, and then from there they had to be stored. The wine was stored in jars, and of course all of that culminated in the feasting and drinking and enjoying the fruits of their labor from the vineyard. There are many poetic metaphors in the Bible that have to do with the vineyard, and that we'll talk about the planting of the vine, the tower, and other things. We see language in Revelation, for example, the grape cluster, speaking of treading of the grapes. This is how God treads the winepress, and we see the blood running up to the horse's bridle. There's all kinds of metaphors that have to do that. I always think of, of course now they don't do it with their feet, but I think of the back in the day, the I Love Lucy show, where Lucy was in Italy treading the vat with the grapes of wine. That always sticks out in my mind. So the treading of the winepress, lots of language in the Bible related to the vineyard, because the vineyard was really one of the most important agricultural elements in Israel. This wasn't the case in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt so much as it was, and there were reasons for that. The reason for that in the land of Israel. The wine cultivation really shaped their culture, and basically for Israel, this wine production was supplemental to grain production, and the wine production took place in the summer. Now, grain production we find in ancient Mesopotamia because that culture was easier to produce and store grain there. The vineyards typically indicated more of a serious settlement type thing because it would take the trees and the vines years to produce grapes, and the grapes to produce the wine. The grapes were very valuable for trade and economic stability in the region. And the origin of viticulture takes us back to early Bronze 1, which would be somewhere around 3,500 to 3,000 BCE. One of the places that we have mentioned is ancient Urartu, which would be modern Armenia, actually around Noah's area, Mount Ararat, which is kind of interesting since what is the first thing Noah did when he came off the ark? Yes, he built an altar, but he also made a vineyard. Wine, again, with agriculture, and one of the more important products of Israel going back many centuries, millennia. Wine production is one of those long-term investments, doesn't happen quickly. And of course, a large portion of the land had to be devoted to cultivating the vines. They may purchase the vine stalks, but wait at least 4 to 5 years for the actual harvest. Sometimes by the time from to planting till producing can be up to 10 years for a full harvest. Well, if you put that in the context of their life expectancy in the first century, which was 35 to 40 years old only, you can see how quite a bit of time was taken up with producing the vine, for the vines producing wine. So if you think about the first person in the family who actually was the one to, purchase the vine stalks and plant them, a first-time vintner really was the one who absorbed all the time that it took in order to bring forth the harvest. The later vintners in the family didn't have to wait anywhere near as long as the first round. And so the whole planting of the vineyard really was for the next generation. It was really a story of an inheritance to the son, which is what we have here in this particular parable. It wasn't so much the first, but the son that would receive the blessing and the inheritance of the vineyard. A farmer who cultivated a vineyard really had his sons in mind when he was doing it to carry on. I mean, there would be no point if the sons didn't take on that inheritance and then develop the vineyard further. And of course, the harvesting wouldn't have to be waiting another 10 years. So planting the vines was, in essence, an agricultural strategy. And it is something we call patrimonial legacy. Because again, the key to the vineyard was passing it on to the sons and on down through the generations. And of course, by many generations down the road, they would produce a great product. So ancient viticulture really was associated with being settled, a type of settlement, and it was a traditional land inheritance through a family. So again, we go back to the language of the king and passing on the inheritance to the son. The vineyard ranks right up there. And really, it was something more for the wealthy than it was. This was something you're definitely going to find at the king's table. So we've talked in previous programs about how the king had this great garden, and part of that would be the vineyard. And so that passing on down to the son became very important in the wine that was produced. So this is kind of the king's deal, the king's drink, if you will. It is said that few human pursuits generate a relationship between the people and the land that they cultivate than being a vintner and producing the grapes in the vineyard. So very interesting, very important. And if you ever have a chance to, there are vineyards in every state, and take an opportunity to go to see how they do it today. Of course, we have modern techniques, but just to see the process of how they produce the wine from the grapes. Very interesting. Now, this, of course, takes us back to a very important passage, chapter in Isaiah. I'm sure you're familiar with Isaiah chapter 5, the Song of the Vineyard. It's really a song, if you will, of kingship. And so that particular song begins, "My beloved had a vineyard in a fertile hill." Of course, we're referring here to the land of Israel. "And he dug it out, and he cleared its stones, and planted with a choice vine." So it begins with planting the choice vine. It's going to eventually produce many vines. And the idea in the ancient world of any temple or the place for the gods usually had something called the tree of life. And the tree of life is a common symbol in the ancient world. And the tree of life was the connecting point between heaven and earth. That was the same function as the temple. The temple was the place, the space, the sacred space between heaven and earth. It connected those two spheres together, so that when one went up to the temple, it was as though one was entering into heaven. That was the place where heaven and earth came together. So the vine functioned in much the same way. It's the idea of planting this choice vine. Its purpose was to connect heaven and earth. And so it even tells us in Isaiah chapter 5 that the vineyard of God is the house of Israel. So it's the living house of Israel, and it's the temple that was built for God's presence. And that the people of Judah were the vine, the planting of his delight. They were the people that were responsible to connect heaven and earth. The idea that Judah functioned as the kings of the earth over the garden of God, which was the earth. Their responsibility was to expand the garden to the four corners of the earth, and that they would to take that message out to the nations and to bring the nations in, to restore the nations. So all of this is language. This is cosmic temple language, is a greater vision of instead of just the small quarter of the land of Israel, but is a vision of a larger kingdom. And so the people of Judah, of course, the line of the kings were going to come through the line of Judah. The Davidic dynasty was from Judah, the planting of his delight. But it says in that context, once again, now remember this is in Isaiah, that God looked for justice. Remember, justice being the main attribute of a king. The king was given wisdom in order to mete out justice with mercy. But he found only bloodshed. And so we see this bloodshed language associated with the trampling of the grapes. And so in Isaiah chapter 5, this planting of the choice vine becomes very important as it's connected to the king. Of course, when we jump ahead into the New Testament, we see that Yeshua calls himself the vine. He is the connecting point, the place where heaven and earth are connected in him. And he actually refers to his body as being a temple. We see that in John chapter 3. "Destroy this temple in 3 days, I will raise it up." And he was speaking of his body. So he viewed himself as that choice vine that God brought to connect the two spheres. He was the mediator between heaven and earth. It was his shed blood, just as the grapes were being tread, that was part of the covenant to restore Israel to her God, and of course to restore us back to God. The vineyard, this is a very costly investment. This is not cheap. In Egypt, for example, vineyards came under the control of the temple. So this was not for the poor. The poor did not invest in this. This was in ancient Egypt a luxury product. It was a luxury product for the pharaohs and for all of their officials. In ancient Mesopotamia, the viticulture was restricted to, again, the royal domain. This was this was great pride for their monarchs. We find this in Sennacherib, in the palace reliefs of vineyards, etc. Again, the emphasis here is on the fact that the production and use centered around the king. It was kept from the commoner. And I think, once again, it's very significant that Yeshua is telling a parable like this to people who probably really had very little experience or exposure to that world. So the wine that came forth was significant, but it usually went to, those that could afford it. It was seen as luxury, and more so in the Mesopotamian Egyptian world than it was in the land of Israel. Grain was a product very common to Mesopotamia, and from it, of course, they have beer products. And in Israel, because there lacked a water supply like we have in ancient Mesopotamia, we've got the Tigris and Euphrates and other rivers. We're reduced in Israel to dry farming because there was not a predictable amount of rainfall every year. Of course, they had cisterns to store water. Water would come like a great flood all at once, and they would have to store the water. So drought and famine became very problematic in the land of Israel. So wine became, in essence, the farmer's drink. It was a little more common in Israel, again, than it was in Mesopotamia. And the farmers really couldn't afford the water to brew beer like they could in Mesopotamia. So we find that bartering, exchanging for grain was a pretty common practice. And the winter rains, and in Israel we had summer drought as well. The vines could actually withstand the dry summers, and because of the dew, essentially, the dew that would happen in the summer. So Israel, this reminds us that Israel is very dependent on rainfall, and without the rain, and of course the rain generally came in the winter, not through the summer, but the grapes could handle that dry summer. Other crops couldn't handle it as well. So it's a very interesting world of vineyards and viticulture, and again, significant that this is a parable that Yeshua would share about the kingdom of a world that wasn't necessarily common to all of his hearers. So as we close out this particular program, again, it all takes us back to the language of agriculture, the vineyard. We're to see it in a more of a cosmic sense, the cosmic temple. It's the world of the kings, the product of kings, and the very interesting period in Israel's history produced. And of course, today we see the vineyards once again in the hill country in Israel. Great products coming forth out of places like Beit El, etc., and Galilee, the wines, etc. We just see a revival of and the restoration, really, of this agriculture in the land of Israel today. We talked about the challenges, and of course the dealing with the famines and the droughts, etc. But the vines could withstand the dry summers. And of course they'd be harvested in the fall. The soil there was kind of perfect is perfect for growing the vines because of the slopes. Their air movement keeps the temperatures moderate. They were loam soils mixed with clay and silt. Also has sand and stone in it, all kinds of organic material. the rocky soils were found to be the best. And the grapes themselves would just thrive in this hot summer environment. And of course, I mentioned earlier about the dew, and the dew would really enhance the grape in its ripening process through the summertime. And so all of this is quite significant. Just again, we associate the temple as the vineyard, the place for the kings, and we see these tenant farmers leasing the temple, leasing the place of the presence of God, and ultimately God would lease it to other tenants who will be responsible to give him his share of the fruit at the harvest. So the vineyard associated with the temple, the sacred space, and the garden, and the kings, this is all part of the ancient Near East world. And it is, of course, incumbent upon the priests they're responsible to take care of the sacred space, to cultivate it, to guard it. That's their responsibility. They were stewards of God's vineyard. This was the responsibility of Adam when he was put in the garden, placed in the garden to cultivate the garden. It was the responsibility of Noah as well, who made a vineyard. And all of this is a statement of the covenant being renewed between God and Israel, but even more importantly, between God and his earth, between God and the eretz, the land, the earth. And so the question we ask, if the kings, the priests were responsible to maintain and guard and cultivate God's soil to produce fruit, who are his kings and priests? And so that again brings us back to us. And so are we doing our job as cultivating and guarding our garden? We can look at it in our own sacred space, but really this has to do with our corporate community. Are we tearing down, or are we building up? Are we cultivating so we produce fruit in ourselves? Good behavior that relates to the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, etc. Do we see our temple in that regard as a vineyard? And so all of this is significant if we are going to look at this particular parable of the vineyard, to see even more, to see up close how the land produced such fine grapes, that produced such fine wine for those who were part of the kingdom. And of course, wine would accompany all the festivals, wine would accompany any kind of special occasion, as a wedding, etc. So it was a very important product of Israel going back to the 1st century, and actually even before. So we'll pick it up next time, talk more about the vineyard and possible meanings. See you then. Shalom.